whatever your experience with AI is today is going to be the worst model that you ever interact with, right? Because
autonomous taxi cabs that are out there driving people around now, which is real world AI, very different from the LLMs.
And this concept of education, how do we prepare kids for the future that is, very rapidly, coming upon us.
Japan, as one example, part of the deal is that they are investing some $550 billion into industries unknown into the U.S. Episode 51 of Market Moves with Mark and Jeff. Two uninteresting guys talking about interesting times here, Jeff. It's good to be back with you today. You and I are riding kind of solo here with no guest joining us today, but it gives us a chance to kind of catch up on all the activity within and around the market.
It's good to be here, Mark. It's been kind of fun to play on that theme a little bit of us not being interesting. It makes other guests that come on, that much more interesting by contrast. But it's always fun to sit down and just, to kind of review what's going on, with what we're seeing out there in the world. And we today had a guest that was lined up, had to reschedule, no big deal. We kind of felt like getting some interesting people coming on and discussing different topics from different perspectives and vantage points, along the lines of what we're interested in, but some added perspectives would be helpful and valuable. So I will continue that trend for a bit, but for today, we're stuck with each other as uninteresting as we are, Mark.
Well, as tolerable as you and I are of one another, we are beginning a 3-day fast on Sunday afternoon, and I imagine whatever patience we had is going to quickly go away as we move in. And so right as this podcast release, I think we'll be entering into a fast, and we'll be wrapping up just as we're recording the next one. So I look forward to doing that. You and I haven't done that kind of in parallel. We've done it separately and kind of quietly. So I look forward to doing that and see if there are some things we can share back with the group.
It strikes me that the next episode could be the last one if we both are recording and hangry at each other and can't tolerate each other by the time we've gone without eating for 3 days. But yeah, I'm with you, Mark. I look forward to it. I think it'll be kind of fun to just talk through, what the experience is, coming out of it and stuff. I was surprised, honestly, when a few people that had listened had said, "Hey, I've done that too. I've really liked or had kind of similar experiences." Just a oddity that I didn't expect to resonate or connect with anybody. I do have to tell you, my wife mentioned yesterday that she was catching up on some of the podcast episodes. If she listens to this one right when it releases, she'll know what I'm up to. Whereas if she doesn't, I can usually kind of fly under the radar for a couple of days. So we'll see if I get caught or not.
Yeah, I maybe you'll be exposed. We'll see there. My wife did watch the last one long enough to tell me that I looked like I guess 2 ago, that I looked like a waiter with my black button-up shirt. So that was nice. She got that in. And Jeff, I look forward to it. I do find it's probably been 6 months now since I've done it, and I've really been noticing over the last several weeks the habit building of stuffing my face and being able to kind of subconsciously withstand that with whatever. It's just I think this thing kind of breaks that cycle of in it. For me, it just goes in a bad direction, kind of left kind of unthought about or without doing something like this. So I am looking forward. It comes at a good time, I think.
That's been my experience too. I've just got a quarterly calendar reminder to just schedule something. I don't stick to it on a super regimented, but just a reminder so that not too much time passes by. But I find the same thing, Mark, and it's interesting. With health and finances are related in so many ways. I find that it's kind of the same thing when you track and are very intentional about just what you eat and trying to maintain a certain level of health. It takes intention to get there. And years ago had done, kind of like a food budget sort of a thing, did Weight Watchers, where to track your points and you'd have to input every single thing. And then later on found myself doing like a budgeting thing. And then the process was so similar that when you are forced to record everything that you do, you just can't skirt around the information that's right in front of your face. You know, I ate 3,000 calories and I only burned 2,000 today, or whatever the numbers are. And it's kind of a stark wake up, but it's just this concept I find applies in a lot of different aspects of life. And for me, it feels like if I can get back to some discipline on the one side, it definitely carries over to, to other things in life as well.
It's been a long time since I've listened to him, but I used to listen religiously to Dave Ramsey way back in the day, and there was like one sort of thought exercise he runs people through, which was just, if you were going to employ a CEO of you somehow, right, to kind of get things straight, whether it's budget or whatever, the first thing they would do is start writing down everything that's going on and understand what that situation was. And I thought it was pretty good analogy, and what we all should probably be doing ourselves in monitoring what's going on. So it's a really good time to take a step back and do that. I usually just do black coffee and water. I think I'll probably do that this go round too. And I don't know if you do the same thing, but that's what we'll do. What I'll do at least.
No, that makes sense. I'm not a coffee drinker, but black coffee sounds terrible anyway, even if I were. I've got some like electrolytes that I'll typically take with just water as well, but that's probably about it. As hot as it is in the summertime, and being out exercising or looking at houses or whatever, you tend to sweat a fair amount. So I figure not passing out in those 3 days is probably a desirable end.
Boy, yeah, that I'm in Houston, and I go to CrossFit each morning, and there's a lot of sweat with this summertime, and so I won't be doing any electrolytes, I think, but we'll see how that goes, and if I waste away in those 3 days. So look forward to doing that. We'll kind of report back on what we got there, Jeff. So we captured our audience here at a Coldplay concert. And thought we would share it with the listener group. For the audio only listeners, it is a love affair that seems to be for our listeners. And anytime we cover artificial intelligence, I think this is probably the third episode that we've done that with, and we get really great response, and both in people reaching out, emailing, texting. And just the viewership is larger there, and Jeff and I are taking note. I think who isn't thinking about this stuff right now and wondering the implications long term, but also wondering what we can do today to start sort of incorporating it in our lives. Whether that's how do we direct our kids or how do we operate as professionals right now. So I guess duly noted, we'll try and include quite a bit more content as it relates to that. Any thoughts on the matter, Jeff?
It's one of those things that you just have to be intentional around. And the more you get exposure to it and your hands on it, the more you can kind of see what it is and what it isn't, what it can do today and what it can't. And it does open the imagination for what it can do in the future, going forward as well. I mean, and what I envision the future looking like, I'm sure it will actually look different. But, this year started out with a lot of discussion around agents and like this agentic approach. And I'm not as far down the path, and it's still the focus, but not quite the buzzword, at least from what I'm seeing as it was, to start. But I just, I can envision, having a lot of like agents out there doing different, very specific, very narrow tasks where I would hope and kind of think that the opportunity for error and hallucination isn't quite as great. I saw just this morning, Mark, I saw somebody post a post on Facebook, the exact story that we've told on this podcast when we had Jim Amarin on. My dad was looking for comparable cell data on a commercial property and asked Chat GPT to go find cell data. It came back with really good cell data. The only problem was it wasn't real. It looked real. I mean, it had everything you would expect to see, but it wasn't, actually from the market. And, somebody had posted in a Facebook group having that exact experience. In fact, I think maybe they were reviewing an appraisal, or I don't remember the specifics, but they were presented with some information. Oh, that's awesome. They go in to verify it and discover, oh crap, it looks great, but it's not actually real. It didn't actually happen in the market. And so, getting a process and having this become a tool that doesn't do stuff like that could potentially really hang somebody out to dry is, I think where it needs to go ultimately. And so I'm interested to see, Mark, if it, how well it gets there and how well we adapt to understanding how to get it to do what we want it to without having, kind of irreparable, mistakes made along the way.
Jeff, one thing that occurs to me that I think would be interesting, because I find myself, my small mind is still having a difficult time connecting the big long-term subject of AI and to the kind of boots on the ground examples of how AI is being used right now. And a couple of examples come to mind that I've seen over the last week. One of them is a use of Comet, which is a browser product from Perplexity. And it essentially has some of this agentic capability built into the browser. And so somebody was providing an example of, essentially using this to have Perplexity compose a post to go on to X or Twitter. And I just thought to myself, I mean, okay, I just wasn't very impressed, I guess. You can already go to those things and just copy and paste it in. And you didn't have to do that, but it was kind of there on the X website. But I was just sort of underwhelmed, I guess, by the example. And I saw someone else just talking about a little business that they had built, and it was for someone trying to help cold salespeople that are sending out cold emails. And the idea was that you would put in the name of the person that you wanted to cold email, and the agent or the product would go search all of the social media of that person, look at what they're posting on over the last several months, and craft a cold opening email that is pertinent to all of their posts over the last little bit, and so I was like, well, okay, that's a pretty cool function of this one way or another that, saves some time and maybe is really helpful. So I don't know, just a couple of examples there that came to mind, but I do wonder if, our listeners might, really appreciate some connection to some of these examples or to stories out there of how it's being used. Because even after Roy was here, I immediately kind of set up the voice to text. I got it on my phone. I've begun some conversations and prompting discussions with an LLM. And, my first ideas of how to use it are still kind of not there, and so it's a little bit distracting or disconcerting, I guess. So I don't know, just some initial thoughts.
So are you worried, Mark, that Grok just doesn't find you interesting, and that's why the conversation isn't really going anywhere, kind of like a bad first date or something?
Yeah, the mirror test, Jeff, is no doubt what we're going through here.
No, yeah, no kidding for sure. As I've been thinking about this, Mark, and especially that topic in particular, what Roy talked about, how to interact with AI in this conversation mode, I had a couple of thoughts. One, I don't love typing, and so being able to speak out a conversation was appealing, right? But your first or initial experience hasn't been overwhelming yet in terms of a success. I had this thought this morning. I'm curious, for your reaction on it. I wonder how much artificial intelligence is intelligence in the sense that we would define it from a human perspective, and how much it's really an evolution of compute and computation and like the next generation of computers and the way that we interact with software. I think it's probably a combination of those two things. It certainly feels intelligent when you ask a question and get something intelligible back. But, I'm almost coming around to wondering, is this just the new way that we will be interacting with a large amount of computational capacity and data, thrown at us, where the PC and early programs were very simple, simplistic, and kind of low data, low computation requirement for interaction. And this is just a much larger scale and a different mode of interacting with our computers. What do you think about that?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this, Jeff, and like at the core, I'm trying to understand what it's doing, and it's this next word guesser that happens to be really good because it's studied the arrangement of words on an enormous scale, not really thought possible or possible some time ago. And so if that's what it's doing, we got to know that, because there's not a whole hell of a lot of inference that's going on here. It seems to me it's just reciting back to us. And one of our one of the podcasts in our weekly consumption is the BG2, and Brad Gerstner there often talks about Google's kind of stronghold on the 10 blue links search business. And it feels like a lot of what these LLMs are right now is just, okay, you do your search. Instead of getting the 10 blue links, it researches the 10 blue links and summarizes them for you. And so it saves a lot of time, and it can do that far deeper than 10 blue links. It can go read 3 books in addition to 10 blue links and on and on. But that's really what we're looking at right now. And in that alone, I think is really, really valuable to all of us and the professionals out here. But it is something quite different than artificial general intelligence that's taking over the world. And I think you've seen all the folks in the LLM businesses kind of getting away from the big scary AGI to artificial super intelligence, which is a step down from artificial general intelligence, as I understand it. And it's like, not trying to overstate what's happening. So I think it's really interesting, Jeff, but in one of the reasons why I'm watching Grok 4 so closely is, of course, this is like 2 or 3x more compute than anybody has put together before to train the model. So that's interesting. But I think they arranged it to try and solve the next word up in a very different way, and would describe that as like the core principles, or breaking things down to like a foundational physics level as a guide to assess the prompt and then give back feedback. So it's a different way of looking at things. And at times, I think the combination of the increased compute and the different way of teaching the system to analyze the query and then respond is resulting in large improvements in output in certain areas. And it's really interesting to me that that's the case.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you experience it by interacting with it. In fact, earlier this week, you had asked a question, within our local Slack group, just around like mortgage volume transaction or something. And so, in kind of the spirit of trying to, have an AI first approach to finding information and answers to questions, I had queried several different models, with the exact same prompt on purpose to see what the similarities were and what the differences were in the output. The 3 I used were ChatGPT, Grok, and then Gemini, Google's version. And it was interesting to see the differences in the responses, like how they went about trying to answer that question. 2 were quite similar. Chats was a bit more in depth and detailed as far as the output. One notable takeaway that I had, Mark, is it wasn't that long ago that all of these large language models were trained on historic data, and they were only good up through like a shelf life that was 1 or 2 years in the past. And so asking them questions about what's going on currently didn't make a lot of sense. And they'd even come back and tell you, I'm not trained on that data yet. I can't help you, sort of an answer. And they've all gotten past that. And really, that's where a lot of the questions are. If you're researching something historical, great. You don't need real-time, internet and real-time information access. But that's what so much of what we care about is what's happening today, or a current product, or a current process, or happening in the political space, or whatever. And so it was noteworthy that they all are like have real-time information, or at least very close to it, which we take for granted very quickly now, but was not the case very long ago. But the way, to your point about how they go about generating or doing this process, I think they're starting, at least from my perspective, to be some differentiation in the outputs of the different models. Some of them converge on very similar answers, and some diverge quite a bit more. But it was a fun little test to see how at least those 3 models, what similarities they had versus where they were less similar.
Well, yeah, it's fascinating, and I my jaw dropped. I think I saw, I don't remember the exact numbers on this, but it is clear that XAI has started late and just sprinted past the leaders in terms of size of compute. And this idea of the bitter lesson, which basically means that the folks like, it wasn't deep research, but the folks in China that had put out an impressive model on with much less compute that was known, it was good. But that the idea that humans aren't going to creatively organize lesser compute to get a better result, that the bitter lesson is that more compute is the only way that you're going to get better results. So sprinting to this enormous size seems to be what XAI is doing. And that's a really hard problem because it's like power management. There's more, I guess, to piece all these together. But, so they've got some 200,000, GPU unit that produced this most recent. I think the next is like 250 or 300. But Elon had stated some goal of 500 million GPUs put together is the goal, and just enormous compute power. I guess that made me think, goodness, whatever the next word guesser has limitations on, applying that much freaking compute is sort of unimaginable in my mind. And if that's the way these folks are thinking, then I see how they're getting to the world where everything is totally different. It would make some sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's just interesting to see the evolution and interesting to look back, at what some of those limitations were, both in terms of infrastructure and computing capability, as well as, just the output capability. And it might have been on the BG podcast that you referenced, Mark. I think it was. They had a guest on there that said, whatever your experience with AI is today is going to be the worst model that you ever interact with, right? Because the pace of change is just staggering. When we think back to when ChatGPT first, kind of stormed onto the stage, 3 years ago now, we're coming up on 3 years, I think. Just the evolution has been very, very staggering. And that's kind of what got me thinking about, this question of, how much of this is true intelligence versus a new paradigm for interacting with computers and data and compute generally. It's interesting to see where we're at today, and hard to fathom, where we'll be in 3 years from now as far as its capabilities and how integrated it is, in our daily lives. It will be, but to what extent and in what ways, it's hard to fully envision, I think.
Well, and Jeff, all of this discussion is centered around language models, the single niche or vertical that artificial and of many that artificial intelligence is putting out there. And we've got a lot of news on these autonomous taxi cabs that are out there driving people around now, which is real world AI, very different from the LLMs. And boy, is that, I think that's a shining example of what this stuff can do, maybe even greater than the LLM. But the LLM is able to tackle just a whole bunch of stuff because we've moved so much of our lives online and through this information exchange.
It's really an interesting point, Mark, that AI in language is one thing, but there's this whole real world application. I saw, and you'll know better than I will about this, I think I saw that Elon in an investor call had said that by the end of the year, they expect to have robo-taxis in half of the country or something to that effect. But it's taking this conceptual and output on a screen in terms of compute and artificial intelligence, and then applying it in the real world where it's able to adapt and react in a driving scenario in a way that a human would, safer than a human would, is really got to, is the goal in order to get, adoption, from regulators and all that sort of thing. But just it's fascinating to see the pace at which this changes.
Yeah, just amazing. I'm I've got an old car with the full self-driving on it, and I mean I used it this morning, and it's just amazing. It's really cool, like these LLMs, to have all of this stuff at your fingertips to be able to test and watch, and have your kids kind of grow up with it one way or another. It's really cool, and promises for a very different world. I think a pretty interesting world, a lot to deal with there. And I think on that front, Jeff, we've talked a little bit about this, but I just thought it was notable that the Anthropic co-founder, Ben Mann, just, I think in an interview about a lot of other things, had just mentioned that he is sending his young child to a Montessori school. I'm not sure that's very groundbreaking, but really, we talked about this with Roy, which is that like schools right now are testing on fact, memory and resuscitation, and that's not going to be very important in the new world. And when we've got this LLM by voice on our phone here, kind of as a companion walking around with us, that we've been flirting with over the last couple of weeks here. Flirting may be a wrong word. We are not doing that. We are just communicating with it. But all the facts are right there, right? And in the same way that Siri or Alexa has brought to our kids that say, what is Jose Altuve, what's his batting average right now? Well, you don't ever have to wonder anymore. You just ask really quickly and you get your answer. So it's the same sort of thing, but that he, saying, look, I'm trying to teach my kids to be happy, thoughtful, curious, and kind. And it was a little bit of a, I think feeding into this kind of give up. What are we humans going to do? But also mixed with a little bit of that curious and thoughtful element, like where we are going to be contributing in different ways as humans to whatever's going on. So I just thought it was notable there. Someone else that is, this is the actual action that someone's taking based on what they're seeing in their front row seat.
Yeah, it really is, and we touched on this with Roy, like you said, but this concept of education, how do we prepare kids for the future that is, very rapidly, coming upon us? It just really makes you step back and question, we know what education and what schooling has been, for a very, very long time. How do we instill critical thinking? How do we instill using the tools and the technology that are there as a true leverage point without just using it as a crutch to make all of our decisions or determine all of the facts and the analysis for us, and lose that ability to think critically, to analyze what's right and what's not? And I think Roy, touched well on that, as far as, learning to, maybe question the outputs, find ways to cross-check them, or verify that what is being provided and presented is accurate. I had an interesting experience, Mark, and you and I, it's hard to imagine much more humble podcast hosts than you and me, in terms of, followers and all of that. But my wife had said, she sent a link of our podcast, the one with Roy, to a couple of friends that are not, in the real estate, certainly not in the appraisal space. They listened, were very interested in the concepts. In fact, one of them told me that she listened to it again and was making notes and stuff. But it was, so the weird experience with this was, we ended up being invited over to her friend's house, and they, so we're sitting there in person. I'm talking to these people I've known forever. They didn't even know that you and I, or that I did a podcast, and they were very interested in what this whole AI conversation had led to. But one of them is a high school English teacher, and we've had previous conversations and discussions around, the AI and LLMs in particular can do a lot of writing. What should be the role of teachers and students in this technological, world that's evolving so quickly? Yeah, and so I think that's part of the reason that the conversation with Roy, resonated as much as it did. But personally, I don't feel quite the identity crisis that some seem to experience, considering AI and what it can and will be able to do going forward. So what's left, to the humans? I may be wrong in this, but I think that, our ability to creatively build and pursue new things is probably untapped in the moment, and will continue to evolve with the capabilities of the technology that evolve both in the computing space, but also in the AI applied to the real world space as well. So anyway, it was a lot of fun to have a conversation with people that quickly were fans of a single episode of the podcast, and maybe more fans of Roy than you and me. But but they're, this concept of how do we educate our kids? Where do we send them to school? What should we expect them to be learning? it's just interesting because the world's changing so quickly. I remember coming out of high school and hearing the stupid dial-up sound to get onto the internet, and this internet thing was like, was an evolving trend, and it's really transformed the way that the world works and operates. And we're right in the middle of living that with artificial intelligence, and it's not what it's going to be, and it's hard to anticipate what it's going to be, but that we're in a sea change, like that. Maybe it's a greater magnitude than even that was. I think one of the one of the interviews I listened to, and if you remember which one it is, tell me. But they were it might have been with Michael Dell, but they were talking about the advent of the personal computer, and then the internet, and then mobile, and now artificial intelligence, and trying to draw comparisons between those different kind of evolutions. And he made a really good point that it's not that those happened in isolation, but one led to and kind of built on the other. You didn't need the internet without computers in the first place, and there was no real need for the next level of like mobile applications and technology without the computer in the first place. And as now AI is a natural evolution in some regards of taking small scale compute and really scaling it up, at some level. And so anyway, it was interesting that these things, his framing made a lot of sense to me, that each of these you can think about independently, but they didn't really happen independent of each other when you string them together.
Jeff, even when you think about it from a available capital to invest in a technology perspective, you have these enormous companies like Google that have been built on and Microsoft that have been built on the internet age, and built wealth in sort of yearly revenues the size of top 15 countries, just enormous amounts of capital, and they've sort of been banking a lot of it. And so they had a lot of money to pour into this. And one of the reasons I think we're seeing such huge innovation so quickly in these like AI space, LLMs, is there's just a lot of capital to invest, and billions and billions are being poured into this. It's just amazing. I do think on the education side, it is clear to me that the Saudi Arabia type education overhaul initiative, get AI in the hands of everyone in the country as soon as possible, and then build the education model around that, is the way to do it, instead of kind of what we seem to be doing right now, which is we just haven't responded in that way yet. But it's how do I make sure that I can prevent AI from being involved in education? And so, I think we've got to make that change. It seems like, David Sachs from the All In podcast is the AI and crypto czars. They got a lot of legislation coming out that is centered in that direction, and I think that's a really good thing. It's time, because every day is a lost moment.
Well, it really is, and it's the ability to adapt to the changing environment, and you and I have touched on this, and it's kind of a theme throughout the podcast. It seems that markets evolve and change. You have to adapt or die. I mean, it's a biological lesson applied to business, applied to education, even applied to countries and governments, I think, at some level. And so, I think education, the challenge is going to be to adapt to the technology and learn how, from the educator's perspective, to integrate and teach it, with AI well, as opposed to, trying to teach what we've always done and assume that any use of AI is cheating or is, unfounded or whatever. One of the other evolutions that's been interesting to see, and I'm curious about your perspective on this, Mark. You'd shared an image with me, as we transition from education to economy. There's been a real evolution that's taken place to this point, and I'm seeing some signs with these trade wars and tariffs and a desire to re-onshore, kind of reverse this trend. I'd love your perspective on what this chart's kind of highlighting as far as what was a predominant industry across the country in 1990 versus 2024.
I think this is certainly highlighting, a reality that we are undergoing immense change for a lot of reasons, technology driven in a lot of cases, technology maybe connecting the world much better. The U.S., having the bright idea to take a bunch of manufacturing prowess and move it overseas, And I think technology on some level allows that sort of thing to happen on a number of fronts. But over more than the last quarter century, we've seen an enormous shift to top employers from manufacturing and retail to healthcare. Some of that may be a sign of the aging of not just the U.S. population, but I think the world population, maybe a little bit lower birth rates and all those sorts of things. But we've been undergoing a major shift. We've got a ballooning of healthcare costs. We've got a ballooning of secondary education costs. Those things have certainly been happening, and I think this chart shows this. And it's a reminder to me that we're going through enormous shifts on a number of fronts. The world is changing very quickly. And I think, to me, Jeff, this begins segueing into the current macro economy and what all of these wild things that the Trump administration is doing. We talk a lot about these on this podcast because there is an attempt to reshore a lot of these manufacturing jobs, and I think on some level that is exciting the market. I think it's not here today, but investing dollars is on the horizon, and a pretty optimistic scenario.
Yeah, it really is. In fact, I was just listening to a podcast this morning talking about this desire or trying to, some companies that are actually executing on this onshoring of manufacturing. And, to hear them describe it, and you got to take it, the source for what it's worth. I mean, these are people invested in and doing this thing. So, of course, they're going to present it in the most favorable light possible. But their vision and description of what they're setting out to do is not just spin up a 1950s or 60s era manufacturing plant, whether it's automotive or whatever else, but it's a very integrated with artificial intelligence. It's still employing and utilizing human capital and workers there, but it's not a worker turning the same screw or doing the same very small little piece of the puzzle in manufacturing something that's, from automobiles to airplanes to, everything that, that we use and consume throughout the, daily life. But it was interesting to hear their vision of talking about, taking people that had never been in manufacturing that, with and using integrating artificial intelligence in the training and ramping up and like onboarding of people to work in these kind of tech heavy or at least tech supported manufacturing plants. But you got one of the points they were making is that in order to do this, U.S. unemployment is already at like 4%. We don't have a whole bunch of unemployed people sitting around with nothing to do, but they're viewing this as kind of an upskilling where laborers in the modern factory can earn a better income. They're more productive than what we would think about in a historic manufacturing environment. And so it's the economics work and make sense. It's kind of necessary because we don't have the population of a China where you can just throw a lot of less expensive labor at the problem to try to do it. And that's been one of the things I've wondered, Mark, is with these efforts to re-onshore, we've got very low population or unemployment, and then we've got a much smaller population than somewhere like China or India. Who's going to fill all these manufacturing jobs? Their vision of how they're staffing up within these plants made sense to me. And at least I can see how it could be possible. It's early days, with this administration's policies and these factories trying to get off the ground and up and running here, but. Yeah, really interesting perspective that we've gone from 1990, where the majority of the states, the top employer was in manufacturing, to where it's only a handful of states, kind of through the Rust Belt area where that's the case. So, we might see something of a return to that, where manufacturing becomes a top employer in some states in the future where it's not today.
Yeah, some 8+ years ago, way before it was any sort of political football, I got interested in Tesla for really this manufacturing possibly the most complicated product, kind of redesigning the product as a whole, redesigning the machine that builds the machine, and doing it in the face of sort of suffocating union control. these are all, I mean, just a few of the problems that manufacturers have to solve. It's not just copy what's done in the Philippines and paste into St. Louis or something. That's not how this goes.
Yeah.
That won't work. We don't have the labor for it. We don't have the wages for it. There is a second level of thinking that's got to, and innovation that's got to be applied here. And I think I saw that early on in what Tesla was doing, and I was just sort of marveled at that capability.
Yeah, that's such a great example, because I think Tesla is, kind of the leader in showing how this can be done. American manufacturer in a space that's very competitive, and lots of domestic and foreign competition in the automotive space, and yet Elon's been able to do it. It's interesting to see him do something, to kind of pioneer it in a way that works, and it's this first principles and kind of gritted out approach that makes it happen. We saw, and we've talked about this before, we saw him do something similar when he buys out Twitter, and then goes on a massive firing spree, and shows that they can take a tech company losing tons of money to make them profitable, and then all of a sudden that becomes in vogue for others to do the same thing. And I think you make a really good point that this desire and effort to re-onshore manufacturing is, kind of, he's laid out the playbook with what Tesla has done, and it's just applied to a whole bunch of other industries as well. So it's a fun trend to track and follow as the days come.
Well, Jeff, before we leave this chart, I can't not point out that the calloused Utah hands have turned to soft retail over the last 35 years. What are we doing there?
That one stood out to me as well. I think Utah is one of like 2 states maybe that show retail as the top employer. I don't know, Mark. I mean, my hands aren't terribly callous from wielding a laser and an iPad, and a keyboard. But I will tell you that Utah does have some, I guess this would fit into retail, but you know of the like Crumble franchise, right? I think that started in northern Utah area and spread throughout the country, like crazy. And there have been a few of those that have kind of evolved like that. So I don't know what's going on. I'm not in the retail space specifically, but maybe it's related to a proliferation of cookies around the country. I don't know.
Man, I'll tell you, Crumble really hit the nail on the head there. That is a good cookie. My wife, at some point after we had ordered 18 boxes over 6 months, pointed out that each one is like twice the caloric intake of like a McDonald's meal or something. So I started to back away from it. But they're onto something there.
I think I may have to ship a box to you come Monday or Tuesday of next week to check your willpower, Mark.
Very cruel. Very cruel, Jeff. Well, I think we can run through some more economic highlight stuff. I wanted to point out, so we spoke on the manufacturing reshoring. We have enormous investment back into the United States. We had a Japan deal, a trade deal announced. We had a Vietnamese deal announced, and we had an Indonesian deal announced this week. That's encouraging. And, not lost on me is sort of the geographic locations in and around China here that we've got. But Japan, as one example, part of the deal is that they are investing some $550 billion into industries unknown into the U.S. And there's a lot of folks that are doing this sort of thing. I think this level of investment may be pretty record breaking, but and we'll see if it happens, of course. But tariffs are hot on everybody's mind. And I think people are celebrating each month's inflation print on some level, like, hey, inflation's low. Why aren't we lowering rates, Powell? And not to mention all the bullying going on with Powell right now, both from Trump and from Bill Pulte and others. It's gone into lawsuits and waste and all sorts of things. But this is a trend. And I wanted to point out the increasing inflation trend that we've seen, that it's under 3 and close to 2. Sure, that's great. But as we look at these tariffs and we're pulling in money, but it I think logically follows that it would increase prices. And, this on some small scale, at least, is showing a trend that, is something to look at. I don't think you can ignore it.
It's been so fascinating to see the way that Trump is going about, trying to advocate for lower rates. And he's advocating for way lower rates, not just a 25 or 50 basis point drop or something. And it's hard to know what people's underlying motivations are. But, my high level perspective on this, Mark, has been that, if Trump was simply laying out, and those, Bill Pulte and the FHFA and others, if they were laying out the case based on the economics and the data, and Powell was making a different case based on, the information that's out there, that would be one thing. The bullying, the personal attacks make it feel like, is there not great evidence to support this other than, trying to, belittle somebody or whatever. My dad had a partner years ago who was a commercial appraiser, did a lot of courtroom testimony and stuff. And he would say stuff that stuck with me. I don't really know why, but one of the things he'd point out, Mark, is that, if he got into the courtroom and in cross-examination, if the other side's attorney let out with personal attacks or something of that nature, he'd always breathe a sigh of relief because he knew they didn't have any actual data to go after him with. And so it was pretty easy to, kind of talk through whatever the personal attacks might be. And I don't know if that's what's happening here, but it feels a little bit reminiscent of kind of that principle or that lesson that Stan had learned in the courtroom all those years ago. But I just wonder, what history will show, because if this trend continues, the worst thing in the world to do would be to start to cut rates if you don't really have inflation tamed. Now, I don't know that this isn't spiking in a crazy way yet, maybe, although, a 0.5% increase in a 3-month period, annualizes to not a trend that you want to see continue. So I would love for inflation to be tamed. I would love for interest rates to come down. I hope and want for those things to happen. When we've seen short-term cuts from the Fed in the past, they haven't automatically translated into longer-term borrowing costs. And I think that's a factor, or at least reflected in, the bond market's confidence in the U.S. economy and, kind of fiscal health and well-being. And so hope that we are on a path to getting on a firm fiscal trend that will support lower rates. But, this trend, if it continues, is not going to lead to Fed interest rate cuts anytime soon.
Yeah, boy. And, you couldn't find two people more interested in some lower interest rates. I think we really need it. We see, we're on the front lines of the difficulties in the marketplace. It's just really tough out there. We don't have to show the graphic, Jeff, but I had just noted that we've talked a lot about how the builders are sort of carrying the day and finding the price points to meet buyer demand, because it's not really met anywhere else because prices have gone up so much and interest rates are so high. But I'd seen a note that Lennar, one of the large builders in the country, had laid off a lot of folks, maybe trying to protect margins that are facing pressure from additional concessions because they're not moving as much inventory. But there were layoffs in 7, 8+ markets that I had seen referenced through X, not Lennar announcements. I want to say that. So questions of source, I guess, but I think reliable from my perspective, and just matches up. It's a nasty market out there, and real estate has been the first into whatever this is, maybe not, it's not recession, but, and we've just been in it for a long time. And I think it's a large percentage of the economy that's in it, and we're looking for a way out. Not sure that's right around the corner.
Well, I would love for it to be. I keep thinking it's around the corner, and the corner keeps revealing another corner to be navigated. The Wall Street Journal had an article that I saw where it was talking about how housing and the real estate market has been this lagging, or kind of this laggard in terms of recovery ever since rates went up quickly in 2023, and it's just been low volume and slow and difficult out there. And anybody who's listened to us more than one episode will be aware of that. We're certainly just living the realities as they exist, but an improvement in interest rates and in the real estate market, is certainly welcomed, but it's hard to know when that's to be and what it'll look like when it gets here.
That's right. That's right. Jeff, I will say, and I think it's worth noting on this podcast that June did return a budget surplus for the month for the first time, I think, since 2017, maybe. And this is very meaningful. Just on the screen here, you've got the last prior Junes over the 5 years, and surplus is impressive. And I think it's hard to refute the success. I think there is quite a bit of attribution to this success to the tariff revenues that are coming in, and I think those are kicking up a little bit larger. Each of these deals that's announced, a lot of them are simply opening up a market that has been wholly closed to United States business forever, and that's really, really positive stuff, I think, on a number of fronts, and it keeps tariff revenue in place. So some of what has been promised is happening. What that does with inflation and all that, I don't know, but we need to see budget surpluses. People are ripping this big, beautiful bill, probably rightfully so on a number of fronts. But the goal first is surpluses for a year plus, stop the bleeding.
With that, we start to pave the way to, I think, better confidence in the fiscal stability of the country and the government, which should lead to lower borrowing costs in the long term. So I'm hoping that is the case and continues to be. I think part of the criticism of the big, beautiful bill was the deficit that remained, in place. I think as we get some of these trade deals in place, though, Mark, and kind of solidified, it at least starts to pave some stability as to what to expect. A lot of these seem to be settling in around a 15% tariff rate on a number of these countries. I saw another article talking about negotiations, maybe getting close with the EU at something on that order as well. And so I do worry that the tariff across the board could have inflationary impacts. I think you make a good point, though, that if at the same time it's opening a market that's been closed to U.S. business in the past, is that an offset or not? Time will tell, but there's at least a potential silver lining in my mind, as that comes about. But progress is being made on the agenda. We'll see if the agenda is one that leads to overall stability and a reduction in risk and underlying interest rates or not. But we're cheering for that to be the case.
You bet. Well, Jeff, I enjoyed the conversation today. We're approaching an hour in a day where we thought the topics might be a little bit light. As we're closing out, I see that the beloved Hulk Hogan has passed away, and oh man, that's an American icon there. That's a sad thing.
Boy, yeah, I hadn't seen that yet, Mark. So we can honor him, I guess, as we close things out. But just interesting. Didn't Ozzy pass away in the last couple of days too? I think
it's been a rough week.
Yeah, it has for stars of the past, I guess.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, enjoy the conversation. Good luck to us on our fast, and look forward to renewing some good conversations with guests in the coming weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll subject them to our discussion around fasting a little bit if we survive to record the next one. But so far, that's the plan. So until next week, Mark, appreciate it.
Take care.